without further ado, I've given you a little bit of overview of what these trees are for, and I think the best way thing to show you guys is to just try it out. So we'll do it panel by panel throughout today, and we're starting with space and Neurotech. So those are two new tracks that will be forming in the next year. So this will be pretty experimental. I think we're going to go all the way out. So I'm very, 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 very happy to have me here today. And Sandberg, Stuart, Armstrong, Samo Burja, and Anita. And so I will ask you to join me here on the panel. We will try to make it so maybe we move the chair over here if a volunteer can help. Yeah, maybe chair over here because then we're right on direction.
First of all, I'm not working on this. I want somebody else to work on this. My work at the Future Humanity Institute is trying to think about how to think well about the future. And actually, we have been doing a bit of work on tech trees. Indeed, I would love to work together with some of you maybe on making actually a proper academic paper about tech trees as a methodology, which might be quite useful for it. Okay, so this mic doesn't work?
It's for the nice.
Oh, okay. No risk for feedback, hopefully. Okay. So the important thing in this case is that this shows up in quite a lot of different domains, and that is automated manufacturing. Anybody who's played Civilization or Alpha Centauri knows that once you get this, you're in the end game. What the really interesting possibility here is that can we actually take assembling of products from an assembly line, from the human-based thing, from 3D printers, and turn it into a flexible tool? In order for that to happen, first, we actually need a big database of products blueprints. Basically, if we could get all the IKEA plans for how to put together furniture, and maybe all the Lego sets on how to put together Lego machines, and actual technology as a training set. Because you need to combine this with machine learning, both in terms of computer vision, but also training up dexterous robotics or 3D printers to actually construct the systems. Probably, if we had a good enough database of products, we could start training machines in virtual reality to build them. That's an interesting and tough machine learning project, but it doesn't sound out of the line of what people like OpenAI or DeepMind would be already interested in doing. Once you have the virtual assembly going, you might want to check that against reality for actual physical assembly. We also need the robotics for this. Right now, we have little robot cells that are relatively flexible. We have 3D printers that represent another cell of robotics, but it's not quite as flexible, but can actually make arbitrary structures. We probably need to combine them, and I know there are some efforts going in this direction. If that gets combined, then we have a way of making at least certain sets of products in an automatic fashion. You basically feed in a blueprint, it figures out an action plan for doing it. Why is this useful? Well, we can make a lot of products, probably not as effectively as if you build a mass manufacturing system, but you can use this to build the parts for a mass manufacturing system. It's very useful when you need small series, like up in space, and this is kind of essential here for the space settlement aspect, because you basically need to automate mining and production in space, because generally you want to have this happen in vacuum or with few astronauts. It also has a lot of interesting effects on emergency and recycling. In fact, the reason I came to this particular node in the tech tree was reading a criticism of undisassemblable products and this manifesto that we need to design for disassembly. And I realized that if that is going to work for this in recycling, you need to automate it, because we will not have the time to do good disassembly. You need to leave that to robots, which means they need to know how to disassemble our coffee makers and other products. But if it can do a proper disassembly, then it can also do an assembly. It's essentially a reversal operation. In the long run, of course, this is a precursor for actual atomically precise manufacturing and more advanced force. But if we can't make it work for Lego sets, we are not going to make it work for molecules. So this is why I think it's a kind of crucial node. It's relatively near term, but we can start working on building that database, figuring out a good way of getting enough data and then starting the training on it. Was that about the right length of a response about the node?
That is fantastic.
Thank you.
Any questions yet? All right, you can make this as interactive as you want. So feel free to just hack from the audience, raise your hand, or just shout out if you have a question. Right? This can be very, very much a back and forth conversation here. And we're also giving around the techno in case some of you guys want to look at it. All right, let's see what we got here next.
It's rather hard to read even at this distance, so you might want to read out what you have on your screen.
Yeah.
Or links can save the world.
Yeah, we're linking them right now. This is Anita's stuff, actually, as I should say. Yeah, we're currently figuring out the Wi-Fi, but I should say thank you so much, Anders, for this first one. That was one of your many slides. Next on our we have Anita, and I'm really happy to have the late introduction. Anders Sandberg is a fantastic senior future humanitarian. He has not only produced what is producing one of the, I think, the books to include all of the books that is currently writing on grand pictures. So if you ever want to have a book where individual books can be chapters too, then please feel free to talk to Anders about it. He's still writing it. It's not published yet, but it is really, really fantastic. So Anders, I think, to me, one of the most optimistic, hope inspiring researchers that are out there. And we're really fortunate they get both an expertise in neurotech and in space. And just seeing another 10 slide here. Next one out, we have Anita. And Anita is actually working with Brandon Turner. We had San Francisco weekend, and she's working deeply on mobile innovation in neurotechnology. In the next year, Brandon and her will be co-chairing our Foresight Neurotech group. And so she'll give you a little bit of an overview of what you can expect from neurotechnology, BCIs, and whole-brain relations. Anita, you go.
Okay. Thank you, Alison. So I will begin with whole brain emulation, since that is largely my focus and the tech tree that you see here. Whole brain emulation is essentially asking the question, is everything that functions within our brain something that must rely on biology? We are developing prosthetics for a number of other parts of our body, and that it logically leads that it could include the brain, and a number of neuroprosthetics are beginning to be developed, and our focus is on doing that for the entire brain. So the things that have to be considered are scanning technologies. How are we going to gather the data that is essential, that's going to be needed, and then how do we get from that to the function, to the things that we care about that would need to be modeled accurately on another substrate. And as far as this neurotech node, we will be exploring things like whole brain emulation, but we'll also be starting with neuroscience fundamentals and working through neural algorithms, as well as looking at technologies like neuroprosthetics and neural arrays, as well as how neural algorithms perform AI. And we will take a look at some of the more experiential parts of what it is to be human. So the questions of consciousness and illusions and how we perceive ourselves. But anyway, back to whole brain emulation, that is the sort of technology that would enable a potential future where we are not necessarily dependent on what evolution has enforced on us, and that we can open up the opportunity to greater exploration, to augmentation, and to a longer longer-term survival of our own species. And if we do so ethically, it can be a very beneficial future where we have access to far more knowledge and far more capability. And I'm rambling a little bit, but is there anything I should elaborate on?
No, I'm happy.
Okay.
I'm particularly really interested, especially in you have me really interested in the ethics problem as well. And we just had Randall on yesterday for an interview, and I think that one really interesting thing and one thing that we need to get better at is really moving in and creating more interdisciplinary community between most of the policy focused researchers and people working on technical areas, because I think that there is still some really across all technologies, but especially in the neurotech one, because there's lots of interesting developments, I think we'll see throughout the day. All right, Stuart, would you like to share a little bit about the tech tree that you're building? And I'm trying to break it up online here, but if I give you few questions from that. What is it that you're working on? What is an exciting end goal and a homeless field? What are the capabilities that stand to be unlocked? And a challenge that we want always to solve.
To answer all your questions there, I'm going to start by talking about strawberries. Eliezer has a thought experiment where it says, get a super intelligent AI to copy a strawberry cell by cell and do this in a way that doesn't kill everybody. If we do imagine a really powerful AI that was doing this, then we have to put a huge amount of human values into it just in order to ensure that this is safe. We don't want it to make the copy of the cell and make carefully sure that it doesn't disrupt the orbit of Jupiter at all, but just inadvertently wipes out humanity in order to do this. So there is no sort of do this safely and carefully that doesn't include human values. And when you start thinking about the AI's actions, its consequences about the future, the things that it can cause to happen, the things that it can prevent happening, all these weird possibilities that we haven't conceived yet and that we can't judge yet. Our values are not yet developed, we haven't encountered these situations yet. Like the first time we encountered the trolley problem. The trolley problem is basically when being nice, being good, and saving people that normally are pointing in the same direction, suddenly they're at cross purposes. And the future is going to be full of these kinds of problems. So in order to have even something that does something as simple as copying a strawberry in a safe way, with all the influence it can have over the future, it needs to not only know the human values that we already have, but the human values that will develop in these all weird situations. And that's the minor problem that we're going to solve. So I'm working at the very modestly entitled Future of Humanity Institute, as those Sanders, and setting up the even more modestly entitled Blind AI cell. Is my phone there?
We're getting it there.
Okay. The key thing is actually this value extrapolation, starting from some training set of this is good and extrapolating into situations where the very concepts that this was defined on start breaking down. The AIs at the moment, where they tend to do this, they tend to go for a paper-slipping style solution, a very generate, a very wire-headed option. But humans are capable of extrapolating our value into new areas in non-disastrous ways. It might be contingent, it might be this way or that way, but we tend not to go, actually being lawful and being good are not the same thing. Let's destroy the world. But the equivalent for an AI is generally let's destroy the world, because that's the outcome of every simplifying AI process. So how do we get this value extrapolation? And we're research thing where we're starting to analyze it. I won't go into too many details, I'll just give you something to get the flavor. There is a thing called coin run based on Mario levels. Based on Mario levels where you jump up and down, and you win if you get to a coin all the way to the right. Anyway, and when you train an agent on this and you do a new level where the coin is somewhere in the middle, then your agent tends to ignore the coin and goes straight to the right. That's because in the training data, that is a perfectly valid interpretation of what you're given. It could be go to the right, that is how you win. But it could also be take the coin.
So the first challenge is to make sure that the AI sees all the different ways that it could be winning. So if, for example, we show them videos of happy humans, one way to interpret this is, we want to see more videos of happy humans. And that's disastrous. But you could also interpret it as, we want to see more happy humans that are then recorded in video, which is much better. So this just knowing that this is a possibility solves a lot of the alignment problem, gets rid of a lot of the paper clipping aspects to it. And there's a lot of complicated other stuff, and some of it is in the slide that may appear 1 year. But I think I'll shut up there for the moment.
Thank you so much. So we started a crazy walk already through some of manufacturing, some of Neurotech, and some of the AI stuff here. I know that I think you also both together co-authored a paper on settling the universe fast on space races. Do you want to share a little bit more on a future in space, perhaps? Let's see if it works.
Well,
if not, we just have to
well, Stuart and me have a paper called Eternity in 6 Hours, where we basically estimate that we need about an afternoon of sunlight to settle the universe. You need a little bit more than that, actually. You need to disassemble Mercury into a little Dyson sphere, not even a complete Dyson sphere, in order to accelerate space probes that can move over intergalactic distances, arrive in the remote galaxies, build Dyson spheres, send out probes to all the stars. But this is mostly a demonstration that if you have self-replicating technology and you have space access, so you can get a significant amount of energy on our current scale, then actually spreading the kind of patterns of information that makes up our machines and the plants on a literally universal scale is surprisingly doable. We don't need astronomical resources to settle an astronomically vast volume. So the main point of that paper was to show that this is relatively easy. We can't do it yet, but compared to the resources in the galaxy and the length of the future, this looks like it makes the Fermi paradox much harder. Then I have a long series of papers about the Fermi paradox. But going back here, the assumptions in that paper was, of course, can you actually automate manufacturing in space? Well, that's very related to my question, of course, about automated robotics. That can, of course, be used with itself as a blueprint. In order to even get there, we also need to solve some other important problems, like the security problem. So nobody takes over my Dyson sphere and use it to make spam instead of settling the universe. There is an interesting issue about how to manage the risks there. And going even further back, do we even know how to make the threshold for settling space low enough that we can start doing the trial and error that's needed for actual space engineering? Because right now the problem is everything sent into space is so expensive that we do endless testing on Earth and really pray and hope that everything is going to go right. But in reality, most of the engineering knowledge we have has been happening in workshops where people have been banging things together, and it's usually failed in embarrassing ways, but nobody gets to know it because they then just melted it down and tried again. And after a while, we get a product that works well enough. You need a lot of trial and error to get many technologies working. And as long as space is, we must first have it perfect before we can use it, progress is going to be very slow. We might want slow progress, for example, when it comes to very powerful AI. This is where we want Stuart to succeed before somebody else succeeds in making a very powerful AI. We want to have the safety measures there right, because if you only get one try to unleash superintelligence on the universe. But when it comes to space, we probably actually want to have lots and lots of trials and things blowing up in amusing or horrifying ways before we eventually can figure out how to do it. And that's also the pathway that then leads to making these self-amplifying technologies that you want to keep under relatively tight control, because at a certain point, you will be able to span the universe. So that I think it's important to recognize that these tech trees are kind of on a continuum from the very near-term stuff. Some of the practical questions like, how do I get a database of blueprints for things? Can I steal that from IKEA, perhaps? Over to, can I train a deep learning model on that? Over to, if we can have automated manufacturing, what does that do to the stability of the global economy? Over to further steps like, can we put this into molecularly precise manufacturing? Over to, well, what should we reshape the accessible universe into?
All big questions. Stuart, you have a few comments.
I just want to make a meta point that I am not a cosmologist or an astronomer, nor is Anders. Our paper does not have anything particularly deep. We have the rocket equation, we calculate the gravitational binding energy of Mercury. There's a few other trivial things. I get to do the cool geodesics where I used my differential geometry knowledge for the first time. But it could have been done otherwise. That was not really necessary. So all that we really did there was put together lots of knowledge that already existed just to sort of find out this one problem. And no one had done that. It could have been done 10 years, 20 years, 30 years before. So there are a lot of really important, interesting things. Well, maybe not a lot, but there are some really important, interesting things there where progress is doable and you don't need to discover new stuff. You just need to put together stuff that's already there.
Similar, like, what do you guys think of grabby aliens and Robin's new research on this? Because you guys also, like, the dissolving the Fermi paradox came from FHI as well. Now with grabby aliens, there's so much stuff happening. You can bring people up to
So I must admit I'm slightly cross at Robin in a friendly way, because I have his chapter in my vast book about grand futures, about alien intelligence. I'm essentially laying out all the stuff that was going on in all my papers. And all the pieces are there to reach the conclusion of grab aliens, and I didn't write it. Now that chapter is going to conclude with it. And then there is this paper by Robin Hanson that kind of puts together the rest of his chapter into a fairly plausible idea. I don't know whether the grab alien argument really works. Basically, it's based on observation that this kind of vast expansion looks like it's possible. Maybe not every civilization does it, but it looks like in the long run, the parts of the universe that can be reached will be settled by those civilizations that want to settle it for whatever reasons they are. We're in an unsettled position right now. That means that we can actually do a bit of observer selection theory and calculate a little bit about the distribution of where we should be in time compared to the other aliens. And then you get a very interesting self-consistency argument that suggests that, they might be out there, they might be about 1 billion light years away, but the universe is kind of getting filled up relatively soon by cosmological standpoints. 1 billion years is still slightly long for us on a human scale. Now, this argument, there are various interesting weaknesses and issues we can go on about, and I don't think this is the right forum for it. But I think it's a beautiful example, again, of taking up pieces, putting them together in a very clever way. And Robin is very clever. He's actually able to see pieces people are lying around and putting it together into these outrageous new theories. I think we should be all looking around to see what's the most outrageous thing I can do out of the standard theories of my field.
Yeah, and I think Robin, grabby aliens tech tree is what, like, on some of these tech trees around here. So check it out. It's definitely quite mind-boggling.
I have a very simple point on Robin's paper. The arguments are correct, the conclusion is wrong.
Ooh, okay, wow.
And when you go to the anthropics, which can get quite subtle, but the main thing is it's evidence that humans are unexpectedly early. We are quite early as life comes. And the only real way of getting that to work is if we have some sort of panspermia. The Earth is not an early Earth-like planet. The Sun is not an early star. If we are unexpectedly early life, that means that life probably had to evolve, take more than 4 billion years. So it has to have started somewhere else and come to Earth. That is, I think, the thing you can extract from Robin's paper. We have long-term disagreements about anthropics. You can talk about this more, but...
That's for coffee. Yeah.
So first go out, we go all the way in the future. And perhaps now, during the reverse way around, Samo can bring us all the way back into the past. Samo's a fantastic historian, also a Foresight Senior Fellow, and really brings a really great historical lens to many of the technologies that we're working on. I think often context is the thing that we're sometimes lacking when we're just creating the technologies as if there has been no yesterday. So can you share a little bit more about the technology tree that I'll be giving around as you'll be presenting it? Here you go. And we'll then hang out.
Okay, I think this is a nice little symbolic token.
You have to talk.
Yeah, this is no longer a technology, right? This is a scepter. It's a symbol that I'm supposed to be speaking. And one of the things that's very interesting to me is that we imagine technologies existing in a vacuum. But most fundamentally, all technologies, at least for now, are tied to human behavior. This means that every material technology that you might see on that tech tree has a complementary social technology. If a society is not complex enough to support a material technology, it's not reproduced, right? The technology might even be lost. We might imagine human history as an unmitigated ratchet of progress, ever accelerating on a smooth, nice exponential curve. I'm not going to dig into the question whether our own post-industrial society is of this type, but it's undeniable that previous civilizations, agricultural civilizations, were not of this type. We have many examples of technologies that are invented, widely used for centuries, and then lost as the institutions of society failed. To give you an interesting example, right, one that might shake your assumptions about history, the most well-known society to have risen and fallen in the Western context is the Roman Empire and the sort of Greco-Roman world that preceded it. Of the technologies used there, it's often said that they did not have meaningful automation, that they didn't use non-human sources of power. We've known for decades that this is not the case. We have archaeological evidence and also written accounts of the use of water power. Water power, not just, to ground flour or to power, to power an iron forge, but water power used to power saws that cut marble, right? Marble stone, if you imagine it being cut, powered by water somewhere in the forests of Germany, just sort of near the frontier of this society. Why are they cutting marble? They're cutting marble because they're exporting it all over the Mediterranean, right? Why are they melting huge amounts of metal? Well, again, they're exporting it all over the Mediterranean. They're using it for military purposes. How much metal are they digging up and melting? Do we know? Actually, we do know. From Greenlandic ice, no, really, from Greenlandic ice samples, we have samples of the atmosphere over the last 2,000 years. And instead of a nice, smooth, exponential graph, we have a graph of air pollution that's much more uneven. We have a nice spike around the time that Roman society rises, that it's building up its economy, a nice decline, and another rise. My challenge to people's imagination is, are we really that exponential curve that escapes towards infinity? Or is all of this conversation vastly premature? And we're that little blip of lead pollution that goes up and then goes down. And as trade breaks down and the politics of the Mediterranean breaks down, there's no reason to cut marble, because there's no reason to cut tons and tons of marble. There's no need to maintain that water-powered saw. And because no one's built that water-powered saw in decades or centuries, eventually we forget how to build them. So the modern analogy, right, that I might finish with is, you do need a market of hundreds of millions of people around the world to amortize and support the cost of sort of a single modern chip fab. And were that demand to collapse, were those global trade networks to collapse, the technology would go with it. Thank you.
Well, okay. Okay, I want to hear from you guys. What do you think? Any questions, comments? We've taken from Neurotech to all the way historically to
it's symbolic. We've regressed technologically just now.
Guys.
Actually, I'm curious. Are there in this audience any space engineers or people from space agencies? Or we didn't mention?
Where? What?
No, are there? Because I see that Future of Humanity Institute represented the space, so we don't have people from space in this audience.
Yeah.
Generally, Europe doesn't have that much of a space program, although, of course, Ariadne Space now boldly says that we're going to out-Musk Musk, which I believe when I see it. But generally, space is an interesting area because it has so high thresholds of entry. So it's worth noticing. It's worth noticing that we don't. Well, this is still okay, just a token. But okay, if it's working, then I'm delighted. So I think actually the Apollo program is a beautiful example of what Samo was talking about. We actually have lost a lot of the blueprints from the rockets, and we can't build some of that yet. Now, that fundamental understanding has not been lost. One could recreate it with some effort. But it is an example that the assumptions going into the Apollo project were of such kind that they were strongly linked to these social behaviors. This is also why technologies that are more everyday tend to survive better. So there is, of course, Gibbons in his Rise and Fall of the Roman Empire. He actually has a point about this very technology thing. And he argues that when a society becomes simpler and collapses, you lose out of the super fancy artistic technologies and the very advanced ones, but the ones that find everyday use, the village smith, the metalworking that you actually need to run a medieval village, that thrives. And he was happy saying, well, this is a ratchet. This is going to keep on building up. The question is, of course, whether this is true, because it might be that the number of people you need to maintain some of the more advanced technology are much bigger. So we might need to find ways of encoding this efficiently in automation, in other technology, so even a smaller group of people can manufacture more things. This is where I think automated manufacturing is quite important. But then getting over to Neurotech, we might think about our medical system, which is also amortizing across an enormous number of people. We need the data from a lot of people, and we need kind of the medical customers of billions of people to pay for the healthcare and the medical technology. We might want to figure out ways of making this more robust too.
Yeah, you had you had two more technology trees here.
Yeah.
One is on reopening of critical theory, right?
Yep. So that is just a small part of. I happen to have a whole bunch of tech trees about human enhancement lying around in my laptop. So I just picked one at random. So in this case, we have these periods during development where our brains are very flexible and picking up on how to walk or how to learn a language. And it looks like they can be reopened. We're already discovering a few things about that. Now, therapies that could do this would be super useful for improving language learning. Maybe I could get the flexibility of learning a new language. Maybe this might be a very good form of rehabilitation. It might also have some very sinister uses for reprogramming of people. But it seems to be a quite powerful way of making us more adaptive in long term. The other one, that was about closed ecological life support systems, which are obviously useful for space, but also obviously useful for making sustainable agriculture on Earth and for disasters. And here I think ecological design is something we need to become much better at. Right now, they're custom made, and I think we're going about the research about closed ecological systems totally wrong. Either it's a main thing like NASA studying an ecosystem with 3 species in it, or you get Biosphere 2, which is vast, impressive, and inspirational, but also was not very good as a scientific experiment because it was trying too much at the same time. I think we should just want to say, we want to solve this problem because it's going to be useful for a lot of things in a scalable way. So I can decide how big is my ecosystem going to be. And then I can get from a computer a printout, this is what you need. This is how much plants, this is how many ants you need.
Okay, lovely. I actually went to Biosphere 2 for a New Year's gathering that we had. And it was very interesting to see both the social experiments and that constructed with also just people trying to literally survive there. Okay, you have done quite a lot of research on agriculture. Do you want to say a few words on this?
Well, historical agriculture, yes. Modern agriculture, less so. I would return maybe to this argument about the fragility of technological systems versus which systems do in fact progress over time. You mentioned medieval blacksmithing. Of course, medieval blacksmithing is already based on iron as the primary metal of use. When your most basic material, your most basic metal of society was rather bronze, which requires extensive trade networks to bring together copper and tin, which for a variety of reasons tend to not be found in the same, geological formations in the same mountains. At that point, really, it doesn't matter if every village had a blacksmith. Eventually, you just ran out of bronze. And the bronze did require this fancy society-wide system, at least these trade networks spanning the Mediterranean. We actually don't even know where around 1000 BC, the Near East, that is Egyptian civilization, Assyrian civilization, Hittites, the Mycenaeans, we don't know exactly where they got their tin from. The two candidates we have are sort of the mountains of Afghanistan and the British Isles. Both of those just feel like so tenuous a connection. If you imagine sailing, at 1000 BC, and you bring this, tin, and your entire society rests on this really fragile network. So, okay, maybe because iron is more common, we find it everywhere. And when it comes to agriculture, we've had very agriculturally productive civilizations. I think that, when you look at the compensation that an unskilled laborer, can hope to receive as measured by grain, the most productive societies are modern society and ancient Sumerian society. Actually, the Greeks and later Romans and so on, their agriculture seems to be less productive than the sort of very first agriculture of those well-irrigated, fertile plains in Mesopotamia. There are numerous times in the history of Middle Eastern civilization where the very centralized irrigation systems that enable agriculture fall into disrepair, and as a result, population goes down as well. Smaller scale agriculture, well, I honestly think that that's just part of the package of human behavior, right? So perhaps at the very dawn of civilization, what's happening isn't that, someone invents agriculture, domesticates wheat or something like this, right? Perhaps always humans cycled between hunting, gathering, fishing, but also small-scale farming, right? There's an article I have why civilization is much older than we thought. I'm not going to go into the full archaeological and anthropological argument there, but suffice it to say it's the images of Homo sapiens as man the gardener, right? The human being actually switching between hunting, gathering, fishing, and farming as needed. But that the crucial breakthrough was perhaps these irrigation systems and systems of organization. So, okay, that's what I did with your question on agriculture. I hope it's good.
Okay, we had a question already here. Oh yeah, Stuart, you make a comment and then we have a question here in the back.
Oh,
Go for it, Stuart.
I have a question too, so maybe they should ask it.
Oh, well, you have the microphone. You have the handle.
I'm just thinking about sort of a big difference between today and the Roman collapse. Romans could do lots of things and do it well, but a Roman legionnaire is basically not that different from a barbarian with a spear, to go for the stereotype. So the return on keeping Roman civilization is relatively low, and when the cost was high.
What is it, ROR, return on Roman systematization?
Well, I'm more thinking, say, if you have today a group of people with a heavy machine gun in a bunker, they can defeat arbitrarily large number of Roman legions. So it's there, and agriculture is also at this industrial scale, and we might get the mechanized construction. The basic thing is that preserving these technologies is so valuable compared with the decay, compared with losing them, that I think that even if there is sort of a society collapse, there will be a very different dynamic, because the groups that can preserve a bit of these technology will just have so big an advantage over those who don't, that I suspect the dynamics might be quite different today.
May I respond?
Yes.
Yeah, sure. To give a response here, my counter argument would immediately be the irrigation systems, right? Because you noted the return on, say, Roman civilization. Well, one of the returns on Roman civilization was, basically extorting a large amount of taxes from Egypt and maintaining Egyptian and North African agriculture, including all of the relevant, waterworks, which were a significant investment. and did also have a significant return. Rome itself could not feed itself, right? It relied on being fed by Egypt. So really maintaining those was a matter of life and death. It really was. But the more fundamental response I would give is that all of the modern technologies we think of as extremely productive are technologies that are viable because of their economy of scale. One of the most underrated secrets of industrial civilization is that the more demand there is for a finished product, the cheaper that product becomes. In other words, the more people that want a car, the cheaper it is to make each individual car. This goes contrary to, say, demand for, a fixed resource like land, right? Where the more people want lands, the higher the price of land gets, or, the more legions you build to take the land from someone else. And I really do feel that if you imagine small groups preserving very advanced technology, you're perhaps not really taking into account, ultimately, all of the labor that has to be amortized, that has to be spread through this vast demand of millions and millions of cars. I think even if you took the most talented group of people in the world today and tasked them, you guys are going to have a monastery. It's going to be the monastery of Elon, high up in the Tibetan mountains, generation after generation. You're going to rebuild Teslas. And because Teslas are so valuable, you're going to conquer the world, riding on those Teslas and with your AK-47, be playing Genghis Khan, but eco-friendly Genghis Khan, right? No, this is a dystopia. This is a fun dystopia. But the point being, I don't think such a monastery is possible. I think it's impossible to build a Tesla in a monastery, no matter how smart the people were or how good their tools were. I mean, perhaps literally nanotechnology. Yes, but nanotechnology would be a unique and interesting addition to human society because it would be a self-replicating technology, right? After all, if I forget how to build the gigafactory, and note the gigafactory is the real product, not the Tesla, right? Whenever you have a car factory has in it at least 100 machines, each at least as complicated as the final car that it's producing, right? So I might forget how to build a gigafactory, but humans, right, we don't forget how to make cows because in a basic way, we don't make cows. Cows reproduce themselves. They're sort of green nanotech, right? As our seeds, as our plants, as everything else. And
Okay, we have one question at the back, and then I want you guys to finish off with the challenge that you want others to solve for the tech tree that you built so that we tie it in, because afterwards I gave out the physical nodes of the tech tree around. If I can get them back, because then we put them actually on here, and I want you guys to add yours too. And so I would love the ones that I gave out to get back. And you had a question over there, Rita?
I had a question about the whole brain simulation. So where are we now at this point? And what will it take to make it actually serve the society, become useful for medicine?
That's an excellent question, and I think Anders also may be qualified to answer this one. So I'll keep it short. There is work being done in neuroprosthetics. It is not as highly sophisticated as maybe we might hope. This is definitely a long road sort of project, but the output of that project, it could be a game changer. Talk about existential hope. That it gives us a shot to really, really go far into the future. So it's worth taking the time to do it and do it well, I think. But I'll let go to Anders.
Okay, I'm going to be on the more technical side. So the kind of classic scenario for brain emulation I laid out in the old roadmap, which is now totally ancient and we need to totally update it.
Yes.
But basically there are three pillars. You need enough computing power, you need a way of scanning brains, you need a way of taking that scan and turn it into something that runs well on the computer. Moore's law is undead as usual. We still seem to be getting enough computing power, even though we're having interesting issues with what kind of chips is running it. The scanning technology has been going forward amazingly well since we're sitting there dreaming in 2008 about what if we could actually take a small cube of brain tissue and scan it and make a three-dimensional reconstruction. We're all dreaming about that day, and now Kenneth and the others are actually doing it for real, and it's working. We're actually getting the full Drosophila brain. Interpreting that scan and turning it into something runnable, this is the area that's been most slow, and this is tricky. And that is also what worries me, because getting back to your question about socially useful scenarios, imagine a scenario where we get better and better computers, we have scanned entire brains, we have big data centers full of the scanned human brains, and then eventually we figure out how to interpret that and run it. Bang. We have basically human brain emulations that can run very fast, and you can multiply them a lot. You have a societal disruption that's going to be disruptive. On the other hand, imagine that we actually figure out how to simulate those Drosophila brains. We're getting our virtual Drosophila and a fruit fly flying around in our supercomputer. That's cute. There's going to be nice scientific publications. Next year is going to be a slightly smarter honeybee. Then it might even be some small fish. And gradually, as computing power increases, it's going to be larger and larger. It's going to be obvious where the trend is going, and society will actually have a chance to start preparing and doing something. The ordering of technologies matter a lot in this case. And the problem is, the technology that is hardest is understanding how to interpret brain scans, even scanning for the right thing. And this is unfortunately up to us neuroscientists to figure out how to do, and probably make a list of stuff we need to figure out before we know which scenario we're heading for. Because that's going to be important to make sure society can withstand the introduction of brain emulation. I actually have a paper about how brain emulation could be dangerous. I'm generally in favor of brain emulation, but there are quite a lot of scenarios where the disruption is too much. And we need to be careful about trying to push for technologies that makes new technologies safe and get them earlier. That's why we want the AI safety before we have really powerful AI. That's why we want to have safety for self-replicating machines before we have a lot of self-replicating machines.
Well, actually, that's a great, I think, point to maybe do with clothing, because I would also be really curious for you to speak about just the relationship between whole brain emulations potentially and AI and AI safety. Like, is there what kind of connection do you see? A positive or negative one, like just up for grabs, and perhaps make that a closing to a challenge that you'd like others to solve.
So, just minor subjects.
Why doesn't we wrap it up in a few words?
Whole brain, I have a whole paper about how it's very difficult to predict when AGI might arrive, it's possible. Nobody's any good at it. Here's the theory, why everyone's terrible. Here's the evidence why everyone is terrible. So you really can't predict it. But whole brain emulations are different. The timelines you have are much firmer, and they're still quite some distance away, I believe. So the most, at least 50% chance is we get some form of AGI before we get whole brain emulations, so it's irrelevant in that way. The way in which it could be relevant is if we get so-called neuromorphic AI as we get closer to whole brain emulations. Basically, as we can imitate parts of the brain in computer, we can string these together to make AGIs, make AIs, and that would just be, this would just be like a slight acceleration for AGI. If we actually get to whole brain emulations before we get general intelligences, that's completely different, because now we have really smart machines that think like humans. All the standard alignment problems are different, because instead of, normally for an AI, you don't need to worry that it'll be corruptible, for instance. You need to worry that it might paperclip the universe, but you don't need to worry that it might be corrupt. For a human in a machine form, you do need to worry that it will be corrupt. You don't need to worry that it'll paperclip the universe.
Yay!
You want to?
Oh, I was just so curious. So if you're doing whole brain emulation, will that come along with personal preference based on whoever it's emulating or the brain system?
Yeah.
Right? So this one would have its own tastes and therefore personality. Would that also come, I guess, with consciousness and thinking that it is the same as the person, or like continuation of?
Probably, if it works, yeah.
From where they started, at least. Like obviously the other person would be able to learn, and I don't know if it would cross over, but it would be like starting over in a new avatar. Spot one.
That seems most likely.
Okay,
And to conclude there, so I see sort of three key challenges for us. The first one is something called inner alignment. If you know what this is, it would be lovely if you could solve it for us. If you still know what it is, well, doesn't. Don't worry about it. But something that should get solved for alignments. The other things is, well, basically, we're ramping up. We're going to work on these things. We have a list of research projects to do, and we're going to be doing it. But we'd love it if people competed with us and got there first in various areas or stuff like that. So do this kind of research, or that's would also be something useful. Other people were doing that.
A race to safety.
Yes, race to safety. An arms race to safety. You must get there before we do. Quick. And the last issue is the issue of deployment, because it doesn't matter we have it if no one uses it. And we have part of our business plan is to address this and start deploying in various ways. But this is going to be a challenge that we could do this in hell with it.
Lovely. 3 very concrete challenges. Samo, no challenge?
Well, you know, my most relevant challenge would perhaps be even related to whole brain emulation, or, you know, alternatively, sort of biological immortality or something of the kind. I think that the saying that, you know, every time a great mind dies, you know, a library burns, we should take that much more literally than we usually do. For the vast majority of human knowledge is stuff that we can't actually explicate. It's tacit knowledge, implicit. It's sort of the intellectual dark matter behind exceptional skill. You know, for every great mathematician that died, I'm sure that the vast majority of those thoughts on mathematics were never put pen to paper or, you know, marker to whiteboard. Can we imagine what the compounding gains of 500 or 600 years of normal human genius might be? I don't think we do. And I think it would be remarkable to see that. And honestly, if that happened, I think ultimately that knowledge would be powerful enough to stop civilizational failure, civilizational decline. Thank you.
Lovely.
Do you have any extras?
Well, I guess I do want to reiterate the translation issue. It is one of the topics that'll be touched on in the Neurotech node coming up in 2022, and Content Hub's Foundation will be doing a workshop on it as well. Yes, this is work that I hope that those of you who are interested in neuropreservation, scanning, and modeling would be interested in taking up to try to see, can we get the function from the structure? Can we figure out how to model this properly? But additionally, I would say thinking about the ethics of it. I mean, we have potential here to make ourselves less fragile, to make our civilization less fragile, to make our species something that can continue and grow in a completely different way. But that also means that the risk is very high of doing it wrong. So thinking of how we can do this in a way that can benefit humanity along the road. So that means, you know, perhaps thinking about BCIs that aren't necessarily going to be so invasive that we harm each other, and then thinking about how the civilization can exist to create. Well, going off of what you said, I suppose how do we maintain our autonomy, and how do we then augment to go beyond without necessarily losing ourselves? So questions like that, I think, are things that should be considered, and the conversation could continue on.
Lovely. Do you have maybe 3 keywords for the slides that you created? Individual challenges?
Don't get me started. I'm going to be interrupting anyway later on. Thank you.
And you're probably interrupting later on. All right. Thank you so much. This was, I think, quite the high-rise start. And so I think in the other panels we'll be coloring in individual bits also that you guys have just really laid the landboard. So thank you so much for the first panel.